Okay, everybody, thank you for coming and welcome back. Just going to have a couple announcements before our next speaker. The first one is, I'll go to Paul first because Joe's just adjusting the temperature in here. Paul has a request for everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Martha. Hi, I'm Paul. I think I know quite a few of you, but if you don't know me, I'm part of the Night Zookeeper team. It's a really good game. You should check it out if you haven't already. But that wasn't why I'm speaking to you. We've had Taya. Could you? Yeah, Taya's been working with us for a few months now, and she's actually currently studying at UCL. Doing her dissertation, and she needs kind volunteers to do some testing with her at UCL. So it'll be weekdays. It'll take about 30 minutes, short survey to fill in, and then you just get to play a game for about 20 minutes, and then she gives you some chocolate. So it's oh, great. Age limit, Taya? So. Yeah. So frequent game players. Yeah. So what we'll do is I'll post the link on the hashtag, and I'll also put it on the meetup group as well, and how you can contact Taya. So yeah. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you. It's also on edugameshub forum as well if you want to have a look. So also I'm going to introduce Jo from YUKI, and she's going to tell us a little bit about what they do. YUKI is where we are now.
Is this actually working?
This is for the live feed.
Oh, well, sorry. It's working. Hello, everybody. We're very delighted to host this meetup, which I think is really important. This is our new office as of middle of July. We're the games industry trade body. That sounds really dull, but we're the ones who stop silly things happening with government policy. We try and help connect people in the industry with people they need to know, and make personal introductions. We do networking opportunities. This office for all members is completely free to use at any time, unlimited throughout the year. So, you know, you can use the hot desking space. We're doing some drop-in clinics with some of our expert members, like lawyers, tax people, stuff that you think is probably quite boring, but you as a business probably need to know. We've got a student membership scheme. We lobbied the government to change the curriculum to get computer science back on the curriculum, which is alpha stage, and now we're looking at making sure that art and coding are treated together. We do this, which is a video games ambassador scheme. So this is people in the industry going into your local school and just evangelizing and telling young people about how awesome games are and how amazing the games that we create in this country are. So we do lots and lots of stuff to help promote, grow and support the games industry. I was, before this, Channel 4 Commissioner for Education with Alice Taylor. And so I commissioned purely games to reach 14 to 19-year-olds. I truly believe that this group is incredibly important to the future of our industry, to the perception of games as a real, powerful force for change in society. And I'm 100% committed to that, and that's why I bloody love my job, and that's why I'm really happy to have you all here. So please get in contact with us if you want to have a similar event here. Then we can make that happen. So please pick up a card. We've run out of annual reviews, but I can send you links around if you need that. Get in touch because we're here to help. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next and final speaker is Ben Lewis-Smith. He has a PhD in human factors psychology. I'm afraid I'm not sure I quite know what that is, but I hope you'll explain a bit. And he also now works at Player Research, doing user research with games in Brighton. So over to Ben.
Great. Okay, yep. So I'm Ben Lewis-Evans. Here's me, where you can contact me on Twitter, and my address at Player Research. And also, if you want to play games with me, Xbox Live, Sony, Steam, and my Game Center ID are there. So, as mentioned, I work for Player Research. Player Research is a company in Brighton. We work with the video games industry. Here's some of the clients we've worked with in the past. And what we do, I'm a human factors psychologist. As mentioned, human factors psychology is about taking what we know about psychology and applying it to technology. So it's basically technology should be designed for people, people should not have to change for technology. So what we do at Play Research is game companies, they come to us, they want to check if the game that they are making is producing the experience they want in gamers. We do play tests, we do things like that to help them improve their game. And we're quite proud that 100% of the iOS games we've worked on have made the front page of the iTunes store. So that's great. Moving off this, as the title of my talk is Dopamine in Games, this was somewhat covered in the first speaker's presentation. However, I'm taking a little bit more of a neuroskeptical look at dopamines in games. Now, neuroskepticism is not someone who doesn't believe in the brain or doesn't believe in neuroscience. Neuroskepticism is a movement within science and within neuroscience, neuropsychology, that just stands up for the accurate portrayal of neuroscience and for it to not be overblown in the media or at events like this or anywhere where it's communicated outside of science.
Ben, can I just ask you to hold the microphone?
Yep, a little bit higher. All right. And so I'll be talking about dopamine. Dopamine, that's the chemical structure there. It's a neurotransmitter. It's in the brain. It is used to signal between different neurons in the brain and send signals, do things like that. As the first speaker went over, there's different places in the brain it's produced. We really don't need to go into detail about what it is, other than it's a neurotransmitter, and that's what I'm talking about today. I'm not going to talk about the areas of the brain that it's produced or activation of dopamine areas very much. I'm more interested in what does the chemical itself, the neurotransmitter, do, or what does it does not do. So, if we're looking at things like that, it's difficult to look at in humans, an actual chemical in the brain. It's not really often that you get ethical approval to just drill a hole in someone's brain and measure how much dopamine is floating around in there. However, what you can do is you can make mutant mice. So you can, don't work with small children, work with mice. And what you can do is you can make a mouse that basically doesn't produce dopamine. So you can take that gene that we know is responsible for the production of dopamine, the synthesis of dopamine, and you can knock it out. So these are called knockout mice, and they're knocked out for dopamine. And I've got a little video here of 2 mice, one of which has normal dopamine production, and one of which is one of these mutant mice. So what you can see is the normal mouse is the one that's kind of showing normal mousy behavior and walking over the other one, wandering around, sniffing everything. And the one that doesn't produce dopamine is kind of just sitting here, not doing anything. And these mice will actually die of not eating enough because, well, I'll go into why, because, but essentially they won't eat enough, they won't look after themselves enough, and unless looked after by shots which restore their dopamine function, they will just eventually die. So if we look at that, why is that? Now, quite often when dopamine is mentioned, pleasure is mentioned. These are not showing up great. Is there any way to turn off the light? Probably not. But anyway, so often pleasure is mentioned, and the reason why pleasure is associated with dopamine so often is that about 30 years ago or longer, if you look back in the science, in the literature, that's what dopamine was thought to do. Okay? And this got communicated to the public, got communicated in talks, and it seems to be an idea that stuck. So why did people think that this is what dopamine did? Well, one of the really early studies that kind of eventually led to this idea is that people would put an electrode into the brain of a rat, into the area the first speaker talked about, what used to be called the pleasure center of the brain, and tie that up to a lever down here that the rat would press, and that would stimulate that area of the brain. And these rats would press that lever over and over again to the exclusion of anything else. They would also, like the dopamine mouse, basically, in this case, they're getting stimulated over and over again. They would keep pushing until they basically passed out, and unless they were looked after, they may die from doing this. And kind of a reasonable step to take where the science was at the time is to think, okay, well, they must be getting some kind of pleasure from that. Otherwise, why would they keep on doing it? All right, because they knew it wasn't something to do with a motor activity. These mice were pushing that lever by themselves. And so you quite often hear a shot of dopamine or a hit of dopamine, or sayings like this being put around as if this is this chemical that activated and you get a response. And you get rather cynical things like serotonin and dopamine, technically the only two things you enjoy. Luckily, while we are sacks of chemicals, we're not that simple a sack of chemical. So as science has gone on and as things have advanced, things have changed in this area. So what we see here is a cute mouse drinking some sugar. And the reason I've put this up is if you look at these mutant mice who can't produce dopamine themselves, what you find is they do still like things. So if they've got a choice between plain water and sugar water, well, when they can get up to do it, as I say, most of the time they just sit around and do nothing. But when they do drink, and they do still do it occasionally, they will prefer the sugar water over the unflavored water. They can still form associations with things. They can still like and have preference for certain items. So that's a little bit of a blow to the idea that dopamine is a pleasure chemical. We've also got some evidence in humans. Again, it's not ethical in most cases to play with the dopamine of humans, so this is not as direct. But if you look at Parkinson's patients, Parkinson's disease is related to a reduction in dopamine. So it's partly why they start shaking, because dopamine, as well as doing a lot of other things, is related to movement. And what you find is people with Parkinson's still like stuff. And they still like their favorite food. They still get pleasure from things. It's not like the fact that they are lowered in dopamine seems to have any influence on their liking or their pleasure. So this is put forward as evidence in humans for this role of dopamine as some kind of pleasure thing, not being very accurate. And so nowadays, and even back in the 90s, people were admitting that they no longer believe that the amount of pleasure felt is proportional to the amount of dopamine floating around in the brain. And the reason why this quote is significant is this guy was one of the real proponents of that fact. He had made a lot of his career on it. So for him to admit that, that's science, it's good, things change. That's how science works. So what comes up next? Well, next is learning. Learning is, of course, relevant here. So dopamine could be to do with learning. Now, you've already heard some of the evidence for why this is thought. So if we look at that, you can get the pre-reward peak of dopamine, which the first presenter talked about, which is this, that you see as a reward is anticipated, that a reward is coming, you actually get a peak of dopamine before the reward arrives. And in some cases, actually, you don't get much dopamine release at all once the reward has been delivered. So the idea behind that is that because you see the dopamine increase and activity in dopamine areas increase before a reward, that the idea is dopamine is signaling you to pay attention, to learn, and it's something to do about making the world a more predictable place for you. It's a learning chemical. Other evidence for this is variable or uncertain rewards. Variable rewards like loot drops in games. We've known for a long time since behaviorism that they're really motivating. Variable uncertain rewards, they work really well. And what we find with dopamine release, as the first presenter already said, is that uncertain rewards produce more dopamine. So again, that makes evolutionary sense actually, because if a reward is uncertain, not completely uncertain, but is pretty uncertain, you actually should try and learn more about it, because you know, you need to try and work out what's going on there. You want that thing again, or that thing presumably was useful to you. It's a reward. And so you should pay more attention and try and learn it. So how does this theory, the theory of learning, stand up to mutant mice? Well, there's a very clever experiment that was done with a maze with mutant mice, the ones that can't produce dopamine. And what they did is they had to go in a maze, and it was just a simple T maze. You walk to the end of a corridor, and then you have to go right or you have to go left. And on one side, there's food that you like, and on the other side, there's nothing. So you need to learn, okay, to the left is the food that I like. Now, obviously, a problem with testing these kind of mice is that, as you saw before, they sit around and don't do anything. So what they did is they shot these mice full of caffeine. Now, caffeine has no effect on the dopamine system. However, it does produce motion. So again, these mice could now move around, right? And so what they found, they compared this against mutant mice who had had their dopamine function restored via an injection, and the ones who hadn't but had had caffeine. And what they found is they were both equally good at learning which side the sugary water that they liked was on. This is quite a big blow to learning theorists, because if they can learn, then that's a problem, because dopamine is supposed to be responsible for helping you to learn. Other studies have looked at simple associations, which is also learning, and have found that rats, in this case, with lesions in areas that would produce dopamine, can still make associations. So again, this is a problem for dopamine being a learning chemical. It's not a complete removal of the idea, but it's a problem that they need to address. So, not looking so good in some areas for learning. I've crossed it out, but that's probably being a little bit extreme. There is still quite good evidence. There's these peaks before learning. There's things like that. Another thing that unfortunately is a blow to the learning idea is you can actually make mutant mice that produce more dopamine, and they don't seem to learn any faster than normal mice.
They have more fun doing it.
No, they don't seem to like things more often either. So that's a problem. So if it's not pleasure and it's not learning, then what could it be? Because we have seen these mice die without dopamine. It must do something. So the other thing that it could possibly be is wanting. Now, if we go back and we look at the mutant mice again, what we can find is, and we look at their maze behavior that we had before, we find that when they're given caffeine and they reach the food that they like, they eat it. But they don't eat as much of it as the ones that have had dopamine restored. And they look at other evidence, and we seem to suggest that what this means is dopamine is somehow to do with how much you want something, want a reward, how motivated you are to do a reward. And people who work in this area even talk about dopamine creating a magnetic compulsion towards a reward, a draw towards it, not just like, you know, you like it, so you want it, but more of a, I have to have that thing. So if you take this line of reasoning, and we can also look in the elderly people that we talked about before with Parkinson's, these people are sometimes given drugs that enhance dopamine production. And what you see with some of these people, not all of them, but in some cases, is they go on shopping sprees, they become very hoarders, collectors, they want stuff, they have a lot of sex, and generally kind of disturbing behavior for people who have given drugs to their grandmother. But again, this doesn't seem to be along with any enhanced learning or any enhanced liking. It's just like a compulsion. They go out and they act manic. So you can kind of go back and look at the previous evidence, especially the learning evidence, and try and apply this view of wanting to try and explain it. So you could say it's a pre-reward peak of wanting rather than some kind of priming to learn. It's just like, I know a reward's coming, and so I want that reward, which is why you see a peak, is a potential explanation for those previous findings from a different perspective. Variable rewards, again, variable rewards, you should pay attention to them in nature. We know that they're very motivating. We've known they're motivating for a long time. And so the perception of this with dopamine is to do with wanting, is that it signals you should try harder. You should want things that are a little bit uncertain, because you need to try to get that thing more than a certain thing. the certain you just go out and do whatever you did normally. With variable rewards, what you actually see is different behavior and more responding. And in fact, if you look at these mice, who are mutant mice, to produce extra dopamine, then there's some evidence that they try harder at things. They put more effort into getting the things that they want. Again, no evidence that they have increased learning or liking, but there is some limited evidence that they seem to be more motivated. You can also go back to the pleasure thing, and we can talk about these mice being compelled to press. So they may not have enjoyed pressing that bar over and over again until they passed out, but they just had to do it. They felt a need to do it. This could be similar to what you see in people with OCD that wash their hands compulsively. Most of them don't like doing that, and they find it really distressing that they are doing it, but they have to do it. They feel compelled to do it. What you can also do is go back to the good or bad old days of psychology, depending on your point of view, when people could put electrodes in other people's brains. And there's an experiment from a long time ago, but actually not that long, where a psychologist was doing this to people. And specifically, he would do it to people that submitted themselves to be cured of homosexuality, or and the associated depression they were feeling about that. And there's one research paper in particular where what they would do is insert this electrode in the same place that they did in the rats, and show straight pornography and stimulate this area. And the research paper is absolutely crazy reading from an ethical perspective, because later on they hired a prostitute for this guy to sleep with while stimulating this area of the brain. There's no way you'd get ethics approval to do that now. And I don't know how he did originally. But if you look through, they did this to lots, well, not lots, but they did this to a few people, and I've seen video, though I can't find it anymore. They showed it to me as a first-year psychology student. I can't find it. But I've seen video of one of these, a lady in particular with this brain implant, and she was really motivated to press that button that stimulated it herself. You could see her just hammering away at it. But if you look at the verbal reports, and there are some of these people that were undergoing this, is the language they use, and what they talk about is increased sexual desire, but not increased pleasure. Stimulation in this area did not seem to induce more fun during sex or cause orgasms to happen by itself. But what it seemed to do, again in line with this idea that dopamine is to do with wanting, is it made their sexual desire increase from what it was previously. It also had an effect on their mood, but it's possible that, say, if you're really depressed and then suddenly you feel motivated to do things again, you're going to start feeling happy as a side effect of that. So it may not be a direct effect. So that has led some people to suggest that what dopamine is it's not necessarily a reward chemical or a chemical that's to do with learning. It's about wanting rewards. So it's kind of one step back. However, one of the leading scientists in this area that is putting forward this idea of liking not being the way, learning not being the way, but wanting being the more important thing, does have this to say about what does dopamine do. And the answer is confused neuroscientists, because it has changed so often over time. And again, as I mentioned right near the start, this presentation is from a neuroskeptical perspective, and this is kind of what I want the main message of this to be, is that science is changing. It's great to learn about all this kind of stuff. But when you are being told this by me as well, and by anybody, is you should be thinking, so what? You should be considering what they're saying. And it's understandable that people say things like a shot of dopamine or a hit of dopamine or anything like that. It's difficult to communicate complex science to everyone very easily. So there's really nothing intrinsically wrong with those words. It's just when it becomes a very dominant thing in the way people think, it could have problems. And the brain is really complicated, really extremely complicated. And dopamine, the neurotransmitter, is also really complicated. The absence of dopamine could do some things. And it's not like in your brain, there's a receptor that's just a dopamine receptor. Those receptors just have an affinity for dopamine, so dopamine is more attracted to them. But if you remove dopamine, there might be other neurotransmitters that can still activate those areas or still act in a different way on those areas. Also, the way that our physiology works, and this applies for nearly everything in our physiology, not everything, but for many things, is that we have a many-to-many reaction or a many-to-one reaction, which is to say that any one thing can cause multiple different physiological actions depending on what else is going on at the body in the time. So this is really complicated. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn about it and you shouldn't try and study it. However, again, the idea is that you should be neuroskeptical. You should question what people have to say. Think about it. Think about the fact that we've known that that variable rewards more rewarding since, say, Skinner was around with behaviorism. But why do you believe it more when someone tells you it's because dopamine goes up than when you've seen behavioral evidence that's been around for a long time? These are the type of things to consider. Not that it's not worth finding out that dopamine goes up, but you should observe behavior. If you're trying to do an applied thing, design a game, for example, you're probably not going to have access to what dopamine someone's producing or anything like that. But you can look at what people do. And what people do with your game and how they play your game and how they react to your game is ultimately really, really valuable for how your game will be used by players later on. Whether their dopamine increased or their serotonin went up or their endorphins reacted, who cares? You got the behavior you wanted. Or you didn't. You should look for practical findings. As I said, there's been findings that have been around for a long time in psychology that neuroscience is working on now. And the reason why neuroscientists are working on it is they say something like, we know unpredictable rewards are motivating, but what's the physiological reason for this? So they're trying to find out why. They're not really trying to find out, does this work or not? Yes, it works. We've known it works for a long time. So unpredictable rewards are pretty motivating. People also need meaningful rewards. If you're hungry and someone gives you food, that's great. But if you're completely stuffed and someone gives you food, that doesn't mean anything to you. It's not really going to motivate you. Immediate reward bias is another classical thing, which is we prefer to have our rewards now, not later. And especially young children prefer this, which has led to some game designers being accused of trying to prey on young children with reward systems and free-to-play games that are saying, like, you want this right now, don't you? You have to pay for it. It's right here, otherwise we're going to take it away. Well, that's quite a strong motivation for people. So that's why you see those in certain games pop up. Providing good feedback is really important. If you don't have feedback on what action your result what result your actions are producing, then you can't work towards the reward again. And again, this has been known for a long time. Don't be seen as manipulative. People generally like rewards, but they don't like feeling like you're holding them back and you're manipulating them to work for that reward. It can put people off. It's been known for a long time again. And there's many more of these that are around, just basic kind of level 1 psychology stuff on rewards that you can look up and you can apply. And they work even if you don't understand the neuroscience of them. You can also read more. Now, this talk today is a summary of something I wrote for Gama Sutra, which in turn was a summary of a lot of articles. Now, I'm not telling you to go there to read what I said, but go there, scroll to the bottom, and I've put every single reference I used to write that report, but also to give this talk today. And I think nearly every reference I used is completely open source, open access. Anyone can read it. And several of them are really good summary papers on dopamine and on the history of dopamine and what it does, and present different angles. And several of them are also good summary papers on reward. So if you can, I think if you search for my name as well and dopamine, you also get to this on Google if this URL's too long. And you can contact me or try and play games with me at any of these addresses. And we can talk about dopamine if you like. But I'm more interested in talking about rewards and practical learnings. And yeah, that's it.
Brilliant, thank you, Ben. I'm sure we'll have some questions that have arisen from that. Anyone want to go first?
I mean, I suppose this is more of a science question rather than the games question, but do you think that because everyone's been so completely transfixed by dopamine, and dopamine holds such a big position in the public eye especially, and so it's kind of been a hot and sexy topic in science for a long time, which that therefore determines where funding goes. Do you think there's the first thing I would think of is maybe everyone's just completely missing what is actually causing the behaviour that we're trying to explain? So everyone's looking at dopamine, you know, is it wanting, is it learning, is it motivation, the rest of it. Is there any evidence to say, well, maybe it's not dopamine at all, maybe it's a precursor, maybe it's another chemical in the pathway that might co-opt with dopamine? Do you see what I'm driving at? So is there anyone working on that, or is it really dopamine and that's the way to go?
Well, actually, if you look in science, nowadays dopamine's kind of boring. It's not trendy anymore so much. The real trendy chemical at the moment, and you can talk to my fiance who actually has a PhD in biology, is oxytocin. Oxytocin, everyone's really interested in that now, and that's the one that's getting lots of mention. And even that one's starting to fade off a little bit. I don't know what's kind of popular at the moment, but it's certainly true that whatever is popular is what gets the funding. Nowadays, dopamine still gets a decent amount of funding, but because things are changing, this argument's still ongoing. There's people looking at it, and as technology gets better, maybe we can get better answers about it with actually being able to get information on humans, because the problem at the moment is a lot of the learnings are inferences from these animal models simply because dopamine is in the brain, that at least the stuff we're interested in is in the brain for behavior, and that's really hard to get at.
We were talking about that probably dopamine was related to compulsion. Is it maybe that objective that some studies have, so you can understand, because you told that the dopamine mice would do things with more motivation, but you probably don't know how to focus the motivation in something, or how it works if you wash your hands, but you probably have a compulsion of washing your hands, but not of eating or other kind of disorder. So maybe the studies want to understand how to focus that compulsion into something like your product or your game or something like
that. Yeah, so if you look at mice with extra dopamine, they're not horribly useful for applied perspective, because again, you're not going to actually inject people with dopamine and then get them to play your game to have an increased effect on them. I think if I remember the literature correctly, is what they would do is they would work harder to get things, so they would push harder on, put more effort into lifting levers up to get the things that they wanted and stuff like that. However, as you say, there is a lot of interest in how you can compel people to do activities. Of course, there's a lot of interest in that. And again, that's where these classical learnings on reward can come in. Again, variable rewards are very compulsive to people. If you think about most gambling games, those kind of things, gambling addiction, they run on these variable, uncertain rewards. And one aspect of that that's interesting, and I didn't get to ask a question of the first speaker, is if you looked at the games that he was designing, he mentioned that the 50-50 was really compelling to people if they thought it was fair. It wasn't just a whimsical teacher. But they were actually pressing a button to roll the dice. And what you find is that could be having an illusion of control effect, which is what you find in people is if you let them roll the dice, they actually think they have more of a chance of winning than if you roll the dice for them, or anything like that. So it may not be that they even perceive it as a 50-50 chance, even if they've been told that, because we have this bias that says that we're successful, anything we do should be more successful. So really you can look at the behavioral experiments as well, not just the neuroscience, but certainly with the neuroscience they're trying to explain like how this compulsion operates. Yeah.
Hi. When you're researching games and the effects they have on people, isn't it kind of reductionist to take this complex human phenomena and reduce it to either observable behavior or just level of a specific neurotransmitter in the brain? So isn't it just kind of reductionist and missing the point that we should be looking into this holistically? And is it practical to do in real world research? Say if you're not an academic organization, you're a games developer, how do you even go about like, looking at dopamine levels?
Okay, so my advice would be going down to the level of a neurotransmitter is very reductionist, of course, but that's a lot of physiology. It's all about understanding the small mechanisms. But complexity is obviously everywhere, lots of interactions, so that's becoming a popular area in science, especially as processing power becomes more powerful. You can deal with these complex emergent structures. However, as a small games developer, no, you don't want to bother looking at dopamine. But you can actually get a lot from behavior. It's not as reductionist to look at the behavior of people in response to your game, because behavior is very varied and very rich data source. And it's not as like saying, okay, they played my game and they did this, therefore every single person will do that. But what you can get an idea of is tendency and how people will react and where they get caught up and where things don't make sense, or where there's just blockages to your player experience being realized. So really I do encourage you, if you are interested in how people react to your game, is to playtest your game. It's the ultimate thing you can do. Of course, I'm going to say that I work for a company that does playtesting, but it is really, really valuable. When we run playtests at Player Research, we have the game developer who's hired us come in. They come, if they can make it, they come and sit and they watch people play their game that they've never seen happen, often never seen happen in these circumstances, and they all go away saying it's painful, but really worth it to see it happen.
On that note, keep an eye out for various playtesting events that we've been running through Leg Up as well. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Ben. So we'll shortly be moving to the Lamb Pub, which is just up the road, about 2 or 3 minutes walk. Follow someone else if you don't know where it is. Thank you very much again to YUKI for hosting us tonight, and thank you to all of you for coming. Keep an eye out for us, our next announcement of the next Leg Up, which will be our Christmas social. Thank you.